Welcome back, everyone, to the Rebel Nutritionist podcast. Today, I am super excited to be interviewing Jaclyn Pederson, who I was actually going to tell you a little bit about herself. But Jaclyn, in terms of what she's doing with pediatric, we're talking today about pediatric feeding disorder. Yes, it is a real disorder, is a real thing, and you're going to need to want to listen up because super important that we all understand what this is. But with more than 15 years experience in program development and nonprofit management, Jaclyn Pederson's broad knowledge of programming in the public and social sectors includes strategic initiative design, fund development, special events, grant writing, healthcare systems, healthcare innovation, and community engagement. Jaclyn was elevated to the CEO position at Feeding Matters in 2020 after working for nearly 8 years to advance the system of care for children with this pediatric feeding disorder. So welcome, Jaclyn. So nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Meryl. Really excited to be in this conversation with you.
Yeah. So please tell us, what is pediatric feeding disorder? Because I think until I came across your work, really, and it was recently, I've always known there's something that this is, right? There's an actual disorder, because it's so prevalent and it's not just picky eating. So tell us about what it is, your work in it, how you got in it, and then we'll get into the meat of this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so my entry into the world of pediatric feeding was just in my background in nonprofit management and finding Feeding Matters as a nonprofit organization to work for. I hadn't ever had an experience with pediatric feeding disorder or whatever the other names we were using for it before it came about, because we really did. We didn't have a name for it, but there was something. We called it feeding struggles, feeding problems, difficulty feeding, all of those things. And so I found Feeding Matters and instantly fell in love with our mission, just because we do so much innovative and collaborative work in not only supporting parents through the devastating journey that is pediatric feeding disorder for families and children, but also collaborating with healthcare professionals who are often feeling like they don't have the information or the access or even the research to support these families either. And so I really appreciate our collaborative efforts in this. And so that's kind of what led me to Feeding Matters and all of the work that we do. But at Feeding Matters, we are about 18 years old. We're coming up on our 20th soon. And for so long, we were just saying we would be doing these lunch and learns. We would be trying to share with early childhood organizations how important it was to pay attention to feeding. But we were met with kind of closed doors and like, yeah, we get it. We talk about feeding a lot. Like, don't worry about it. And that was the overwhelming feeling we got. And so it's really hard when you don't have a name for something, like you just said. Like, you knew that there was something there, but you didn't have a name to call it by. So then it doesn't feel real in that sense. And so what we did was we gathered a bunch of experts together to say, okay, what is this? And all of those experts were saying, well, in my world, I'm this discipline, I call it this. In my world, I'm this discipline, I call it this. And they're like, but we need to work together to treat this. So maybe it's something that's shared amongst all of us. And that's what became pediatric feeding disorder. And so the true definition for that is when a child is not eating appropriate for age. So that may be, you're expecting your 4-year-old to be on table food, but they're drinking a nutritional beverage to get all of their nutrients. Or it could look like any other different thing. You can't drop your child off at infant care or preschool because they eat differently than their peers. And then not only are they not eating for their age, but there may be dysfunction in any one of 4 different domains. And this is, I think, the really cool thing about this pediatric feeding disorder kind of framework is it's all disciplines working together. So if there is something happening in the medical domain that is undiagnosed, you're seeing it potentially pop up in the psychosocial domain, that like children are trying to say that meal times are painful. But we need to be looking at if that's a medically caused pain. And so the definition is if there's dysfunction in any one of 4 domains: medical, feeding skill, psychosocial, and nutrition. And so those are kind of the 4 domains that you work on. And that's for us, we all have to learn to eat. It's not something that we know. And so we are all learning to eat within those 4 domains too. When we are feeling okay and feeling good about food, then we're gonna eat a little bit more. And so those 4 domains also really apply to just your own feeding development as you grow and build your own relationship with food too.
Fascinating. Yeah. I mean, I have so many questions about this. So like I'm like trying
Good.
to start. I thought so the interesting thing for me when I was looking at, your
Yeah.
work, so the number of children that have this, right? Like so your statistics comes up 1 in 323 children have cerebral palsy. 1 in 54 children have autism, yet 1 in 37 children have pediatric feeding disorder. Like that is a staggering number.
It is a crisis. People do not realize how prevalent it is. Families are not talking about how challenging this is. They are not showing up to birthday parties. They are feeding in a room at a party so that you don't see what's happening. It is happening in the dark.
Yeah,
And um, it is devastating for families going through this because there is not as much support,
right.
and not as much education and information. And even the general public doesn't really know as much about it. And it is more prevalent than autism. It is more prevalent than cerebral palsy. And one of the things is the autism prevalence continues to become more prevalent, but a large percent of autistic individuals also have pediatric feeding disorder.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's going to be very prevalent because it is. It's, more than 3 in 5 children with a chronic health condition also have PFD. And it's a comorbidity to over 300 other conditions. So it's just
Wow.
a very real, very big problem that we
Yeah.
kind of need to face.
So do you think that, and we're going to get to the autism piece in a second, because I really do want to address that. But do you think that and there's so many things that we can talk about in the context of that, but do you think it's more prevalent because we're paying attention to it? Do you think it's more prevalent because of the world that we live in, the environment? You've got two parents working sometimes, or there's not enough time focused on feeding. You've got kids who are being introduced into school early. You've got processed foods. Like, is there some common denominators, right? I'm sure it's not just one. Like, what are we seeing in the common denominator area in this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of variables at play, as it relates to the prevalence,
Right.
because I think we are seeing a lot of challenges at meal times for families. There's a lot of stress on families. And
Yeah.
so when there's a lot of stress in general at the mealtime, it's really challenging for it to feel like a good scenario. And that's without any other circumstance. So in development, for any development delay, it takes longer than expected. And for us, we learn to eat over 7 years and sometimes even longer to refine our skills. And so if there is any disruption in that, both on our skills and how we're learning our skills, as well as, and I think this is where the stress comes in, and the fast-paced nature and kind of even the processed foods on the nutritional side. But um when we are going through those experiences over 7 years, we are building how we feel about food. And
Right.
so, if it's painful, if we don't have the skills and we're choking, but also if there is some challenges in terms of, like, the stress at mealtimes and how we're feeling, like, that's all building and it's exponentially building. So, I think there's a lot of variables that we need to look into more, and for us, at least naming it and calling it out was a start, knowing that that's the foundation for all of the other things that need to come after it. Because
Right.
there is still because it didn't have a name, it's not really well taught, and so then you don't have pediatricians asking about it a whole lot, and then there's not a lot of research about it. So, like, the questions you all asked are great questions, but they are great research questions that we just, like, don't have an understanding on.
Right. So, and I would imagine, that like, so how much of it do you come up against like, oh, it's not a real problem. He's young and he or she, right, are young and they'll grow out of it.
Yeah, that's
Or, right, is that
yep, a bunch of myths like that. I think they'll grow out of it is one of the biggest myths, and the fact of the matter is, there are instances where they will grow out of it, but that doesn't mean that they don't need intervention. and that
Right.
they don't need some support or that the family doesn't need some support. Um, well, I have a 2-year-old son who grew out of it essentially. I mean, we're still working on some things, but like, uh, and that doesn't mean I didn't need support when it was happening because
Right.
I think that's what's challenging. Um, I think so they'll grow out of it is definitely one of the myths. It's picky eating is another one of the myths. Um, I think that causes families to feel invalidated to say that it's just picky eating.
Right.
The challenges, there's definitely a picky phase. Like there are picky eaters out there. But it doesn't mean that it's not something serious
Yeah.
or, you know, it can be disguised by calling it picky eating when it is something more
Well,
serious.
and that was gonna be my next question. So how do we know if it's just picky eating or we're really dealing with some kind of disorder? Because here's the thing that I go back to. I've got, children who, again, on the spectrum, right? Autism. I mean, I work with children who are on the
Yeah.
spectrum, and you always, okay, not 100% of the time, but 9 times out of 10, you see some kind of picky eating, you see some kind of challenge
Yeah.
with eating, right?
Yeah.
So you have that, or then you have, so like, how do we know if it, and is, do we automatically assume that someone with autism or on the spectrum will have this kind of disorder? So, so you've got that, but how are we recognizing a picky eater from, like, I just don't want to eat the green stuff, to someone with pediatric feeding disorder?
It's a very big question. I would love to say that there is like this exact toolkit for how to differentiate. At Feeding Matters, we do have a 6-question screener that really works to identify if we need to look at feeding a little bit closer. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's differentiating between picky eating and pediatric feeding disorder, but it at least allows for a better and deeper conversation around mealtimes, which is what it takes to tease out picky eating versus pediatric feeding disorder. A lot of times, what we encourage people to do is to go back to that kind of framework and, thinking about the different domains. Is there something medically going on? Which is the case in a lot of autistic individuals. High prevalence for GI conditions,
Yeah.
which cause pain, or constipation, which allows you to feel full and not interested in eating. And so there's a lot in that like medical domain, feeding skill domain, nutrition domain, and then psychosocial domain. And then I think one of the biggest indicators from like a picky eating and pediatric feeding disorder standpoint are actually the two. One is there a history of feeding struggles? Because we often talk to our families and it was they had trouble breastfeeding, but we
Mm.
figured it out, we got a bottle. And then it was, "Oh, they kinda had some trouble moving to solids, but we figured it out." If you've been figuring it out for several years and your pediatrician hasn't been supporting you in a feeding development journey, we might need to be looking at something a little bit deeper and figure out if there's something else going on. And then I think the second thing is, with picky eating, we want to see a time limited phase. But with children with pediatric feeding disorder, and then even older children where it converts to a lot of psychosocially driven an eating and feeding disorder called ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, that's, when the restriction becomes very intense. And so if food continues and it's like pervasive and consistently a challenge, like then it's something that we need to look into. And sometimes picky eating needs a little support too.
Right. So, so if you are a parent, right? Let's say you're, and I'm trying to give an example, right? I mean, let's say you're a parent who is, right, you're not sure, you're on the fence, you're trying to, I mean, that's why parents come to us, right? My kid only eats 4 foods. All right. Like that's a
Mhm.
the chicken finger, the beige diet, I call it,
The
right? The chicken,
beige diet, very
yeah,
prevalent.
fingers, the, so what are we telling families? Yeah, how are we, what are you doing on your end? Because I know what we do on our end, right? But what are
Yeah.
you telling them in that context? Okay, my child only eats 4 foods. Like, what are the steps someone can take to help their child?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is to find a provider that really listens and understands them. I think in that sense, having a voice like yours is so important and helpful. What we do on our end is we work to support a family by really offering them that emotional support and that listening ear. We have a suite of family support programs where one program is, connecting a parent with a parent who's been there before or who has faced similar questions as them before. Like a lot of times parents have questions about the use of a tube if they're being kind of quote unquote threatened with a feeding tube,
Uh,
and those different things. And so we are able to connect a parent with another parent who's had a similar experience and is able to kind of walk them through and provide some information about pediatric feeding disorder. But because it's only a diagnosis and only has been a diagnosis for 3 years, it's just not well known. And so
right.
in that sense, it for us, it's about informing families that this is a thing. And we have a family guide that kind of your PFD 101 of like, here are some of the common tests. Here are some of the questions to ask. Here's like who the providers you might want to speak to. And here's how to take care of yourself in the meantime. Um, because it's really important to be able to support a family through this experience, and we feel like we're able to offer that support while at the same time trying to provide a lot of education for the field and advancing the research in the field, and then raising awareness of this condition, because it is not really well known.
Right. So going back, so you do have sort of a resource of like, do this first, look to reach out to this person, the medical doctor, the this to kind of,
Yeah,
uh,
that's true. I didn't share that in detail. So at feedingmatters.org, we have what's a family roadmap. So if you are worried,
oh, okay.
there you can go to feedingmatters.org and it's get help, and it's a true roadmap, exactly what you're saying. It's like first step, here's our 6 questions. Are you red flagging on 2 of them or more? Then we need to look at this further. And then it's about reading the guide, talking to a parent. We have a list of providers on our site, and other resources and information available based on what your level of wanting to learn about it is.
Yeah. So didn't realize it was only 3 years that it's like an official diagnosis.
That's the
So
problem.
right, right. So because here I'm thinking, and as you're talking, I'm sort of my wheels are spinning with all the people that I have come across who
Yeah.
probably legitimately have this, and the parents are sort of, against a slew of challenges and obstacles. And I do think the first one being that probably how well versed are these pediatricians on this disorder? Like, how do we get that out there, right? How are you guys? I'm sure that's that is your first right order of business is getting to the pediatrician's office to not be dismissive that it's just picky eating. Oh, they'll grow out of it.
Uh, it is incredibly hard. I'll tell a story that happened recently. A pediatrician that like we know hasn't come to many of our events, but we've sent the pediatric feeding disorder paper, which has like the conceptual framework. It has the definition, it has the diagnostic criteria. We've sent our resources, our questionnaire, our rack card, when to refer, how to refer, who to refer, all of those different things. We've sent it to this pediatrician. So we're thinking, okay, they're like first step in education. We know we need to do a little bit more, but they at least are aware that this is a real condition. And then I get a referral from the pediatrician that says, "Hey, I just sent a family your way. Their son is autistic and has the picky eating that comes with it." And I'm like, "Oh, no, we've so much more to go." And so
Right,
it's so
right.
disappointing and disheartening sometimes. So I think it's not their fault. They do only like learn 3 hours of nutrition in medical school and graduate school for other professionals too.
Yeah.
There's still
Oh,
so
yeah.
much that needs to happen. And so we try to be a good source of that information, and we are reaching out to pediatricians all of the time. And the ones that get it, I think, get it instantly. And then there's kind of a few other sets where you either have to do a little bit more to help them understand. And then there are some that are just not interested in hearing it and do have their beliefs, but those are always the pediatricians that we find that families have a hard time interacting with. And
Yeah.
that's kind of the nature of it, I think, sometimes too.
Yeah, I mean, what pediatrician could be closed-minded to this when I mean, maybe it's an older one who's not from I don't know, I don't know. I'm dumbfounded by the fact that someone would really be, like, dismissive. Although I shouldn't be because, I deal with this all the time, right? But it just is like, hello, how do you not pay attention to this? And
Well, I think so. Here's one of the other reasons why I think it happens, and it's because when you're looking at childhood development, like pediatricians do, and like a lot of early childhood development organizations do, I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. I fill out these forms all of the time about my child's development. They ask, here are the questions about social emotional development. Here are the questions about gross motor development. Here are the
right,
questions about problem solving. There are a few questions about can they hold a spoon? Do they feed themselves? But there is no domain that talks about feeding development. And so
right,
the other piece of like our advocacy work is this is why it's a problem. Not only did it not have a name, check, we got that, but now we need to build it so that people realize that pediatric feeding, typical feeding development, is a domain in early childhood development. And when there is something going on, we need to get ahead of it. And
right,
so that's the other reason why it's hard because you wanna bring pediatricians or other healthcare professionals in on the conversation and know that, like, I mean, besides the ones that just dismiss it hardcore, but help them kind of learn it as its own developmental domain too, and maybe that's a better way to educate them. I don't know. We honestly play with many different scenarios.
right. I can imagine. I can only imagine. So, so when you're dealing with kids on, and we'll have to share that resource. We'll make sure that we get that from
Oh,
you and
thank
share it.
you. Yeah.
Uh, no, I'm really like, it was funny because when we first came across what you were doing, and I'm like, oh my god, we have to talk to her because I know that there are so many people out there who are dealing with these kids who are just not eating the way they should be, not
Yeah.
growing developmentally the way they should be because of it, and they are at a loss. I mean, they are just at a loss,
Yeah,
and,
and then they
uh
grow up and school is challenging and social environments are challenging, and then they get further and further restricted. That's when RFID comes into play, and it's a real challenge.
in the world of, again, like, anyone on the spectrum, I think that has, whether it's like you mentioned, right? You can have kids with gut disturbances who, GI issues, who there's pain, like you mentioned, and discomfort when they're eating, and some of these kids can't articulate it, right? And some of them can. I, wonder sometimes if they're actually taken seriously as well, right? How much of that kind of stuff is swept under the rug because it's sort of just a byproduct of the
Mhm,
autism disorder.
mhm.
Mhm.
That's what worries me a lot when we're not treating this like a standalone comorbidity to autism, and we are just assuming it's just your symptom of it. Um, we don't do the things that we need to support families, to support kids.
Right,
Um Yeah, because I mentioned the GI conditions, but even something like chicken nuggets, those are easy to chew. They may be easier to process, and so it's like, what one or they also are beige and have a specific preference. So it's like, what piece of the domain is this a preferred food? And so why is this a preferred food?
right.
Because it could be in any domain.
Right. So, like, what are the tools and strategies? I mean, other than the roadmap and right, like, how are we practically? And is this in your wheelhouse? Maybe it's not. Are you referring out to someone who, like, it's so new? Like, how would you even be an expert in
I
this
know.
to be able to say, okay, well, here's what we're doing in this criteria. Here's what we're evaluating. And then here's how we help you, right? Like, I know we're helping kids all the time with these picky eating, right? Picky eating
Yeah.
habits. We're making recommendations. But is there sort of a global, like, other than the roadmap, or are you kind of dealing with practitioners in a domain like let's say nutritionists, like, or or therapists, right? Like, I guess I'm, like, trying to come up with a how do we help resolve this for these
Yeah.
kids?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. It's something that weighs really heavy on me because I have a great responsibility to be here for the community of Feeding Matters, both as the children that have PFD themselves, as well as their families, as well as the healthcare professionals who treat them. But this is an issue that has not gotten attention for 40 plus years.
Right.
And so you have people who have done trial and error, who have found kind of the way for what works for them. You have people who are learning about things through other means, and doing kind of self-education. And then you have some research happening, but not in any meaningful way that helps longitudinally. And so
Right. Right.
the unfortunate thing is, while we do have suggestions, of what to think about, how to use the 4 domains, how to think about how those 4 domains interact and what specialists you need to pull uh,
Yeah.
in considerations for if those specialists are even available in your area, because often that's not the case as well. How you're considering your psychosocial development while you're learning these skills. Um, there's still a long way to go. And
Right.
so that's why the family guide is really helpful in the sense that it helps you think about the 4 domains. It helps you think about all the specialists. We do have the provider directory that helps you find specialists. And oftentimes, and this is, I think, any medical disorder, you have to find a professional that works for you. There are vastly different types of treatments and there are vastly different types of specialists. And so that's also a really individual choice. But there's still a lot that needs to be worked out through consensus, through collaboration, and through research in this field as well. But families are in the middle trying to navigate the storm right now.
Right. 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 Well, and look, my hope is that there is at least it gives them some validation to the fact that what's going on with my child is very real. I'm not making this up in my head, and it needs attention.
Yeah, because you feel insane.
Yeah.
And you're doing insane things to make sure they're gaining weight
Yeah.
or make sure they're feeling supported. Um, and you need support and you need someone who understands. And so that's why, while it's still new and do need to be sharing about it more frequently, I think finding someone who can at least who can be your partner in it is a
Mhm.
good win. We always share with families that if they aren't feeling heard, then that's kind of one of the things that you need to be paying attention to.
Right. So this is I would assume this is a national outreach, right?
Yep.
So
So,
yeah.
yeah, Feeding Matters is a national nonprofit organization. We are headquartered in Arizona, but this is a world issue. So, we were able to get the code here in the United States, and then broadly, pediatric feeding disorder is used as a framework across the world.
Oh,
Um, and so, it's a movement worldwide.
got it. And are you seeing certain pockets of areas, let's just say within the country, maybe within the world that are early adapters to this or, kind of jumping on board more than others?
That's a really interesting question. I think there are great things happening in pockets kind of everywhere, because you have passionate individuals. Like, you're a great example of a passionate individual that's open to learning more. Um, and so you see that everywhere, and you see experts everywhere learning more. And so in that sense, it's not like it's like, oh, like the East Coast is doing better than the West Coast on this. But it's almost like within all of those places, there's these like pockets of people that are learning more, developing more, trying to be more trauma informed, and like trying to do all these things, and learn and develop. One of the challenges is, sometimes when a child needs like a more intensive, or a higher level of care, that is even more limited. So there are not many of those types of teams
Right.
across the country, and often a lot of them are more on the East Coast.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Um, Fascinating. So this leads me to sort of the next, which you alluded to, and I don't know that a lot of people know what RFID is. So because again, if these things, if we're dismissive of these kids with this, pediatric feeding disorder, and then it does progress, like what? Because maybe there are some kids, people of our listeners whose children have progressed to ARFID and they have no idea and they're not sure what to look for and whatnot. So can you enlighten us about ARFID and what that is, and again, what those resources could be and so forth?
Yeah, so ARFID is actually a little bit older than pediatric feeding disorder. So ARFID came about in 2013 when a group of eating disorder psychologists were kind of seeing older kids that they couldn't describe kind of what was happening with their feeding. So they didn't
Right.
have a name either. And so what they did is they extended the feeding disorder of infancy and early childhood diagnosis in the mental health handbook and
Good.
expanded that to call it avoidant restrictive food intake disorder and said it can happen across the lifespan. It's not just in infancy or early childhood. And so it describes a lot of the similar things as pediatric feeding disorder
Mhm.
because it involves restricting food, it involves not having a body image disturbance, it involves complications psychosocially, complications nutritionally,
Yeah.
um, a big fear of food, and that can be like, I have an allergy, but I'm so scared about my allergy that I'm now restricting my diet a whole lot to a point where it's impacting my health.
Got it.
Um, and so because there is such overlap with PFD, there is a lot of conversation about how do you identify when a child has PFD or when a child has ARFID? And right now, the guidance is sometimes it could be that they have both, because PFD may start early in life, like you were saying, and then it can flip to ARFID because if you have traumatic experience after traumatic experience, the primary driver of the reason you're not eating is that it's psychosocially you don't want to eat because it's not enjoyable, and you remember all of that history, whether you grew out of it or it's been diagnosed or not. And so with ARFID, I think many more people know the term ARFID,
Right.
but for example, like Feeding Matters hasn't been doing much in regards to providing resources for ARFID children and adults and families up until the last few years. And so, in that sense, there's a vacuum of resources. So, there's not great resources for families once they find the ARFID diagnosis. And so, we as an organization are trying to enhance and improve that and make sure that they do have those resources because you see the same qualification problem with professionals in RFID as well. They're trying to
Right.
learn their best. They don't know about it. And so you do have families finding some support with some individuals and finding really bad situations with other individuals. But there are a lot more questionnaires available for RFID. And, there's just much more research around ARFID because the eating
Right.
disorder world has a lot of research. And so there's definitely some good research happening in the ARFID world that will help give us answers once it comes out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know we've dealt with a few of those too.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. I mean, but again, it's being able to recognize that it is a different kind of eating disorder. And and the interesting thing is I've come across so fascinating, you look at human behavior, but I've come across parents who are the parents themselves are in denial about what the child is going through.
Yep. Yeah. Um, that is a common thing. One thing that we do at Feeding Matters in our family support program is we try to understand where the family's at in terms of their own processing of what's happening. Because some family members are like, "I know this is wrong, like, give me all the information, I wanna dive in." And other family members aren't ready yet to
Yeah.
hear it. They are more comfortable thinking and thinking about it in terms of a picky eating situation, and then it's like baby steps to get to all of the support that's needed that like, "Okay, if we're gonna call this picky eating, we still need to be looking at medical, feeding skill, nutrition, psychosocial." And so that is definitely a challenge. And I know the other thing that they're looking at, especially in the eating disorder world with ARFID, is how does a parent's feelings about meal times interact with a child's feelings about meal times because that's how that develops too. Like
Oh, yeah.
I'm bringing all of my experiences into this meal, and I'm bringing how I feel about food into this meal.
Right.
And so there's a lot to be learned there too.
Yeah. Well, look, we see that in the world of disordered eating,
Mhm.
right? All of these eating disorders, right? I've got young girls coming in and mom is, hello, look
Mm,
what's the mom or dad, right? That they are
mhm.
perpetuating this behavior.
Yeah.
Uh, and look, I it's hard when you have a parent, it's interesting. I have a situation now. The parent is clearly dealing with some type of lifelong eating disorder and the kid actually is normal, right? Let's call it normal feeding and normal healthy weight. And yet the parent is just like constantly berating the kid. It's like
Mm,
reverse. It's like the reverse. It's like reversal. And I'm like trying desperately to not have this child, this young girl, end up with an eating disorder, right?
yeah,
And so
yeah.
the belief systems that our parents, grandparents, whatever hold around all of that too is an obstacle to overcome with with all of this.
Well, it's such an obstacle and it's so complex. And like parenting in general is really complex, let
Maybe
alone like the added complexity of meal times where you're trying to like grow your body, you're trying to
yeah,
develop your own feelings about yourself, as well as what your relationship looks like at that mealtime. And then as a parent, you either are aware of how you're feeling about meals or you're not aware. And then that causes all different domino effects.
right. So, that goes back to how many parents are just more or practitioners or all of that, right? How many people in general are just dismissive of this because they just think it's how it is. It's how I grew up. This is how it is. And they'll get over it, not realizing that this could be, they are now perpetuating this lifelong issue for
Yeah.
this.
Well, how many adults do we talk to that tell us, like, vivid memories
And
of their meal times and being forced to sit at a table until they ate their whole plate or any of those things? Like,
yeah,
that builds and manifests in different ways, whether you were a child that had PFD that didn't get addressed or it was something that developed into either ARFID or can't stand certain things to this day because it may not be to the level of ARFID, but it's still a challenge for you.
yeah,
Those are all very real scenarios.
yeah.
And we all
Um,
have them. Like, we all have vivid memories of those things because it's so personal to us.
Yeah, listen, it was it's like I almost don't even wanna say this, like, it's so embarrassing for me, but, like, yesterday was my son's birthday, so
Yeah.
he found a video of me telling my younger daughter who when she was so my son turned 28, okay? So we found, like, when he was 12 or something, 11, 12, and my younger daughter's whatever, 4 years younger than him, so she was 8 or 9. And she was a little heavier than maybe she needed to be, and she liked her sweets and whatever. And me being in the profession that I'm in, right? I was always but like they posted a video on Facebook of me. I think my poor little daughter has like this is her trauma behind
Yeah.
my mother mothering her. But like she asked for a piece of cake. It was a cookie cake and it had icing on it and she's like, "Well, I want the one with the balloon icing," right? And I'm
Mhm.
like, "Well," so I cut it for her. I'm like, "Well, maybe you don't eat the whole thing because it's really big, or
Yeah.
let's scarred her for life. Like, mom,
Yeah.
well, I'm fat. Mom thinks I'm fat,
Yeah,
right? So,
but I mean, like, you also exist in its context of, like, how you were raised and
yeah,
society and, like, all of these different variables that don't it's not just, like, you existing on your own in your relationship with
right.
her. So it's, like, such a bigger issue, and it is. It's, like, the source of that. I mean, that was very much me. I grew up in ballet, and so it was, like, a body image was talked about
Or
frequently. Mhm.
listen, I tell one of my stories. Funny that you should say ballet, right? Because when we were growing up, there was no jazz and hip hop and all that. It was ballet, and it was right. And I also remember. I will tell you. I mean, look, I had an eating disorder when I was younger, and I think it stemmed from that
I would
because I
not be
remember
shocked.
being in ballet class, not being able to fit into the costume, the right the recital outfit and the teacher was like, "Oh, she's a little chubby," and boom, that was all I needed
Yeah.
to hear, and I
Yep.
equate that I'm not pretty, I'm not this, I'm not whatever, right? But it's those things and those triggers like, ooh.
Mm.
So, yeah, it becomes a real thing.
It is. It can be a very real thing.
And I think, yeah, it goes back to having a family system where you can be open and communicate and share um and and I always vowed that with my kids it would be different. And look, I'm sure I imparted some kooky stuff on them, and whatever. But I was very cognizant of that most of the time, I think.
Well,
Um,
and that's what it's I mean, I think it's healing that you guys can even laugh about that or have a, like,
right.
conversation about that. Like, that's healing in and of itself, that it's
Yeah.
not just, like, something you carried with you or she carried with her beyond.
Right.
And that's, like I mean, that goes back to even childhood development too, like, having our kids be able to say, "No, I am scared of this food. This
Right.
is, like, hurting me." Those are conversations that even a long time ago would have never be accepted at a table.
Oh,
And
no, no.
so I feel like we're making slow progress. It's just progress in all of these different spaces that kind of move us forward.
Right, right. So true, so true. So, like, what would be something, right, if our listeners, or for the people that are listening, or even for myself, right, my team, that we would be able to do to really kind of spread. I feel like this message really needs to get out there. What do we do to help, perpetuate it and pass it on?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, like, sharing your story if you do have one. If you don't have one, I think it's important to share with your friends and families that you're kind of a safe space for this, because often what we hear from our families is they're doing this in secret. They're doing this behind closed doors because they don't feel comfortable sharing how hard this is, and it's very traumatic for them. So I think being that listening ear where you can, or that safe space at a party, like, to really ask them their needs and what they need, is another way to do it. And just being talking about it. I mean,
Yeah,
we try to post things on our social media a lot, so liking and sharing that is certainly helpful, but I think it's those one-on-one conversations that make a big difference.
for sure. Yeah, so we'll have to get all of that and share it and post it,
Yeah, I
and
would love that.
get coaches to share it too, and even reach out to, a bunch of the pediatricians that I know. We've got some really great ones that we work with that I would be like, "Here,
Love that
get
idea. I
get in
love
the,"
that idea.
because we've got a lot of forward-thinking pediatricians, well, not a lot, a handful, around my area that I know would definitely,
Yeah, we can give I mean, and that's for anybody that's listening, but we can definitely give you, Meryl, like, any rack cards or anything that you wanna share with pediatricians.
yeah. All right, good. Well,
Mhm.
we'll definitely be in touch
Yeah.
on that. Anything else I didn't bring up that you would want people to know about?
I think if this is something that, like, you're hearing this and you're wondering if this is you in your life, with your kids or even just as an adult, like, know you're not alone in this.
Yeah.
It can feel very lonely and isolating, and so please reach out to Feeding Matters if you need support. We're here for you.
Great. And like I said, we'll link the information in the show notes, so you guys can all have that and share that. And we'll obviously have you on our socials so that you can do that too. So yeah, I mean, great conversation. Great conversation about, everything having to do with pediatric feeding disorder, how to recognize it, the resources that are available, what you can do as family or didactically in the greater scheme of things, and just sharing and getting the message out. All super, super important. And thank you for this work, Jaclyn. I mean, it's really talk about being the one of the lone souls in this, and really, right? Yeah.
Oh, thank you. It's
Forging ahead and really, sticking to the things that you're passionate and committed to really is a beautiful thing. So thank you for your work.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate being able to have this conversation with you. It's just I mean, this is how we get out the word, and you're a
Yeah.
huge part of that, so I appreciate it.
Awesome. Awesome. Alrighty. Well, good luck with all of that and your efforts and your endeavors. And we'll continue to, like I said, spread the message and follow the progress of
Great.
how this moves forward. Great
Thank
conversation. Thank you, Jaclyn. This is your Rebel Nutritionist, everybody, signing off. Make it a great day.